What I'm going to attempt to show you is how I locate my metal fittings onto the fuselage before drilling them. What I have here is one of my pre-made brackets. It is roughly the same width as the piece of ash here, and this is the angle at which the gear leg comes off of the fuselage. Since I had made the gear legs first with the width from this fitting to the rear fitting in mind, I was able to get the gear legs made, and then I was able to make my templates out of the white cardstock and get this angle correct. And then of course I've got the slot milled for the wing strut attach fitting to come through. So now that I've got this made and I've got my marks located on the fuselage, what I have done, this represents the wing strut attach fitting that will come through here. Now there'll be two of these welded together, so it will be twice as thick, but this is the correct dimension as far as width. This piece of metal here represents the thickness of the metal strap that is supposed to run the width of the fuselage between the front fittings and between the rear fittings. This piece of metal just represents that thickness of that strip. That metal strip is going to mount directly onto the plywood from this fitting over to that fitting on the bottom side. This represents that thickness. So I just lay this on here. That represents my strap. This piece then rests on the metal piece. That represents my wing strut fitting, and then my fuselage fitting just gets slid on like that. And then I just locate this where I need it between my marks. So now that I know that this fitting then is in the correct height up and down this way, so that my wing strut fitting will fit the way it needs to fit. And of course it also takes into account the metal strap that has to tie these two fittings together. So I just lay it all together and position it between my marks like that. Now I can go ahead and drill these holes into the fitting and through the uprights, through the plywood. Okay? Now I've got my brackets drilled and I'm getting ready to position them on the fuselage so I can transfer the holes from the bracket into the wood. Now I've got a piece of plywood. I don't know if I can get back here. There's a piece of plywood behind the fitting that is 1/8 of an inch thick. That represents the 1/8 inch plywood sheeting that covers the entire side of the fuselage. And obviously I have not done that yet, and I am always glad that I haven't, because it's always nice to be able to get into here to work on various things. Something as simple as transferring lines from your ash piece onto the fuselage, for instance. So I'm in no hurry to put the plywood on the sides, but I need to account for that somehow, and I just use some scrap pieces of 1/8 inch to keep the fitting where it needs to be, as though the sheeting was in place. And I've also used my my spacer and my wing strut attachment bracket, and I've put them in here. You can see that that all fits nice, and I've got my bracket roughly between my marks. Now these are going to move around, because what I need to do next is to bring the actual landing gear over and start trial fitting it. Here's the rear bracket, 1/8 inch plywood, the spacer, and my wing strut attach fitting. Fit nice, and it's roughly between the marks. Alright, now I got to bring the landing gear itself over, fit it between the two fittings, and possibly shift these around ever so slightly to get everything aligned, and then I can drill these holes all the way through. Next, I brought my landing gear over and I trial fit it up here in between the brackets, and I had to pull these off a few different times and rebend this angle to get this to lay on the leg properly and to keep this up against the fuselage properly. I had to rebend this bend here a little bit on both brackets, but just trial and error. Bring the landing gear up and fit it on here. Check how it fits underneath the fuselage, check how it fits up against your bracket, and then tweak these as necessary, bend them, move them around a little bit. And once that was done, I checked the distance from the firewall back to this edge, and I compared it to the landing gear that's currently in place on the other side, and they're the same, about 9.5 inches. And then, since all of the wood struts that make up the landing gear, since those were made in pairs, the two front legs were made at the same time and the two back legs were made at the same time. So I know that since this distance here is the same and those leg angles are the same, that I'm very confident that this landing gear will line up perfectly with the landing gear on the other side. Now, I've also used, since I've got my plumb bob in place and I've got my level still in place, and I've checked to make sure that the tail post is still on center, I did a real quick visual check where the axle location of that landing gear in relation to the axle location of this side of the landing gear when I held it in place, and I referenced it to this line here on the floor, and they are very, very, very close, if not exactly the same. So I'm very confident that the landing gear is square and set up correctly. Knowing all that, I went ahead and I drilled these holes all the way through the fuselage on both fittings. And I'm going to pull them off there so I can clean up all the wood shavings that are behind them, and then start laying out my holes for the actual legs. Now, the way that I had done these holes, I just used my my white template and laid it over the fitting and transferred the holes from the template onto the fitting. Then, as I said, I positioned the fitting in relation to the gear and then transfer the holes on through the wood. I'll do the same on this leg of the fitting. I'll take this fitting off, clean up my mess. Using the template, I'll lay the template over this fitting, transfer the holes from the template onto the fitting, drill the holes, mount them back to the fuselage with bolts, and then position the leg, and then transfer the hole through the fitting onto the legs, and then take them over to the drill press and drill them through.
Before I get too far along with the live action videos, I wanted to back up for a moment and include these two photographs that give you a little bit different perspective on the brackets and the spacer that I use to represent the strap that runs across the bottom of the fuselage, as well as the piece that represents the wing strut attach fitting. You can see in this picture here that the slot that I made is big enough for this single strap that represents the wing strut attach fitting, but in reality that strap's going to be twice as thick, and I ended up having to go back and enlarge the slit for this to pass through. So when you make your cutout, make it large enough for the actual thickness and width of the wing fitting that you're going to actually be using.
I've got my inside fittings pre-made, pre-bent, and I've also got the inside bottom fittings pre-made, pre-bent. So what I'm going to do now, since I've got the gear in place temporarily, and I've got this fitting already pre-made and pre-bent, what I'll do then is I'll just transfer these holes here directly onto the fitting here. And then once I have that done, I can go ahead using the template and put the holes in the fitting where they need to be here. And this fitting will be done. Since these holes will be drilled all the way through, and since these fittings, these bolts here, are all the way through, these two bolts and the two bolts that will be here will dictate exactly where this bracket needs to be on the inside. So if I've done my math correctly and I've got the pieces parts shaped correctly, this should all bolt together relatively quick. Okay, back to the front fitting of my landing gear. This is obviously the outside front fitting. This is on the left side of the fuselage. And I've got my inside bracket fitted and bolted. And then I had to fit the bracket on the underneath, which I'll show in a moment. One thing that I wanted to make note of with this bracket is after what I had done was I bent the bracket first and laid it in here and make sure I got the angle right. Once I had done that, then I put it on here, ran a small drill bit through this way to mark the hole locations on this bracket. Then I drilled the bracket, then I brought it back here and bolted it in place firmly so that it would sit nice and tight along this edge. Once I had it nice and tight, then I went ahead and marked these hole locations. That way these holes didn't pull the bracket away from this edge here. So this top side is finished on this corner. Let me get underneath and I'll show that bracket underneath.
Alrighty, so here is a still of how I fitted the inside bracket for the front landing gear leg. Like I had said, I positioned the bracket in place and held it where I wanted it, and I used a small drill bit to transfer the hole through the outside fitting, through the wood, and onto the back side of this fitting. And then I took the fitting and drilled those holes. Then I brought the fitting back over and temporarily installed it like you see here, with a couple of bolts going through the bracket with some washers to hold it in place with nuts. That made sure that the bracket was kept tight up against the vertical wood pieces, and then I can go ahead and mark the holes down through the bracket onto the wood ash piece. And of course these holes for the wood ash, those holes were located using the template for the bracket themselves. So basically what I had done was any holes that needed to be precisely fitted, I would directly transfer them through the wood. So here's another shot of that inside. So the two bolts at the top, those holes were located, as I said, by going through the outside bracket and through the wood using a drill bit that would fit through those holes. Once that was precisely in precision, then I could mark the other 3 bolt holes that you see on the bottom of the leg. Those bolt hole locations were just transferred from the white cardboard template onto the bracket. Then when I drill the bracket, I bring it back over, bolted in place on the vertical leg, and then transfer the holes or drill the holes down through the bracket through the wood. So I don't know how clear that is, but that's pretty much how I worked it to make sure that everything was lined up and everything that needed to bolt to something else would in fact do that.
So I'm now partially under the fuselage, and these are the landing gear fittings from underneath. This is the front strut fitting, and you can see that it's been cut for the wing attach strap to come through, and the wood of the gear leg itself has been cut through for the strap, and then of course that bolt then will pass through the strap and help secure it to the fuselage. Here's the bottom fitting. Those two straps that are dangling off of the bolts, those are going to be the tabs for the support cables. But those particular ones you see there are not going to be used. Those weren't made correctly, so I had to remake them. I'm in the process of remaking them, so those two there will be scrap. And then I've got, let me unzoom this a little bit. Here's another fitting. This is a back leg fitting here. These are pretty much finished. The only thing I need to do is weld the straps to the outside. This outside fitting here, the strap will pass through both of these, but it actually gets welded to the outside one. I still need to do that. I've got the straps made, I just haven't put them in yet. And then here is another front one. So that's where I'm at so far. Now I've got my spreader bars made and fitted. I just finished welding those today. And you're thinking, welded what? Well, I'll show you with some photographs here in a second. But I got the spreader bars made that go across here, and those are fitted. I have to put them back in and start working on the straps for the support cables. That's what I'm going to be working on now, is getting those straps made so I can get the support cables put in here. Here's the outside of the rear fitting, and this is the outside of the front fitting. So that's where I'm at, and I will continue on.
Alright, so here's a method that I use to transfer the holes from the ash block bracket to the other ash block bracket on the other side. Once I have the bracket positioned on the leg the way that I want it, I go ahead and drill the holes through the bracket, through the wood leg, and then I'll run some bolts through that bracket, partially through the wood, to hold it in place and to hold the leg in place in relation to the bracket. So then I can go ahead and position the bracket on the other side, and that can be held in place by hand or with some clamps. And then go ahead and using a drill bit, you drill through the bracket, through the wood, to the back side of the other bracket, and that will leave a mark so that when you take that bracket off, you can take it over to a drill press and then drill through those little marks. And when you come back and have it all assembled, everything will line up, the bolts will fit right through all your pieces, and you can go ahead and temporarily at least assemble these pieces so that you can fit them to the fuselage and fit them to your fuselage brackets. Here's a picture of the, I believe this is the front left gear leg on the inside or underneath of the fuselage. Couple things here to note. I have the cutout at the top of the metal fitting. That is going to be for the metal strap that goes from this leg across the bottom of the fuselage to the other leg, as well as it's going to have to be notched out for the wing strut attach strap that will go through here as well. So that metal bracket as well as the leg, those are going to have to be notched for those metal pieces to pass through. The other thing that you'll notice too, well, I guess you won't notice, not in a still photograph, but the hole locations on this back bracket are dictated by the bolts that come through the L-shaped bracket that's on the top inside of the fuselage, as well as the outside metal bracket for the outside of the leg. So you do that outside bracket first, and you do the L-shaped bracket that's on the inside on the top of the fuselage. Once you get those located and fitted, those bolt hole locations then dictate where these brackets need to be located, so that all of your bolts pass through all of your brackets and everything lines up correctly. But I'm sure you'll figure all that out when you get into it, and hopefully some of the live action video will help demonstrate that. But this is what I came up with. This is how my actual legs and brackets are going together, so I was happy with it. Marking the location for the cutouts in the wood legs was actually easier than I had expected using the method that I came up with here. Basically what I had done was I removed the leg and the brackets from the fuselage yet again. You will find out, at least for me, I must have had the legs and the metal fittings on and off of the fuselage and on and off of the individual gear legs. I don't know how many times I had to take them off, put them on, take them off, put them on, but get used to it, because it may end up being the same way for you as well. But anywho, take the legs off of the fuselage and leave the brackets attached to the legs and then just make little reference marks for both metal brackets onto the wood where the wood cutout needs to be. So in this picture here, you can see the little pencil marks showing where the slit or the cutout needs to be for this bracket, and then in this other photograph, the oval, the drawn oval, was traced from the metal bracket, and it's the ends of the oval that dictate the edges of the cutout for this particular bracket. So here you see the pencil marks for the one bracket on the bottom, and you see the oval drawn on the top representing the cutout for the other bracket. Then you just connect, you draw straight lines from your pencil marks up to the ends of the oval, and then that represents the cutout that needs to be in the wood leg so that your wing strut attach fitting can slip through it, and it will align perfectly with both metal brackets on both sides of the gear leg. So there's the finished product with the metal brackets removed, and I had basically, the way that I did mine, I just cut this out with a large wood file and just kept working it down deeper and deeper and deeper, using the wing strut attach fitting, the actual fitting itself for this particular leg. I used it as a guide. I just kept throwing it, laying it down in this cutout until I got it deep enough and wide enough so that the fitting, the metal fitting, would drop down in here nicely. I don't remember at the moment if the plans dictated to make these wing strut attach fittings out of two individual pieces welded together or a single fat piece, but mine were made out of two individual pieces, and this picture here just shows the two pieces, one on top of the other, ready for welding. So using the plans as a guide, obviously, and using the actual wood legs attached to the fuselage, I was able to take these two brackets and mark them for bending. Obviously, to bend them both at the same time would be fairly difficult with the tools that I have to use, so I ended up bending them individually. So what I had done, I took the brackets and put them in a vise, and you can see here that they are at two complete different bend angles on the one leg. And it is basically a little bit of trial and error yet again, where you bend one bracket by itself and get it to fit the way that it needs to fit in your gear leg and up underneath the fuselage. And then once you have that particular piece bent properly, you make a duplicate of it. And the way that I did that was just to put the good bent piece in the vise alongside of another piece and keep bending the other piece until it perfectly matched the piece that was fitted. And then once that's done, obviously those are a matched pair, so keep them together until you get them welded. And then of course you just stack one on top of the other. Make sure that they're clean. Stack one on top of the other and edge weld the entire fitting around the entire perimeter. And you will have yourself a wing strut attached fitting. Man, I struggle with saying that. It's a tongue twister.
This is one of my wing strut attached straps. This is what gets passed through the gear leg fittings, and it gets welded to the one fitting. This will actually go this way. If you can imagine, the wing will get attached to this end. There'll be a hole in here obviously for a fork, and the wing strut will come off of here. This passes through the gear leg underneath the fuselage. This is where that bolt will come through that I had pointed out on the gear fitting. And then this here will have another hole in it for the tops of the landing gear support cables to attach to. And this is again, this is two pieces of that 0.105 high temperature stainless steel. Again, not necessary. It's not necessary to be high temperature. It's just something that I was able to get my hands on for cheap, and I figured I might as well make use of it. So it's two of those pieces bent individually and then mated together and then welded completely around the edge, around the entire fitting. And like I said, these have already been fitted. In other words, they've already been bolted in place and they're bent properly and everything's ready to go. I just need to fit them in there and weld it to the fuselage fitting, and then I'll be all set.
Alrighty, so here are the legs in place with the various brackets temporarily bolted in place to the fuselage. I've got my axle just laying across both pairs of legs just to make sure that the alignment is good. You can see the forward top bracket on the fuselage has already got one of the wing strut attaching straps through it, and the fuselage fitting on the back has not been fitted yet with its wing strut attached fitting. And I've got the V block down at the bottom underneath the axle in place. Got the rubber matting between the axle and the block. And this is just a fit up. I just wanted to throw these few pictures in here so you could see kind of sort of what things start to look like when you get it pieced together. This is the opposite side. This is the left side of the fuselage, and again the forward fitting has the wing strut strap in place, and everything else is just coming together and trial fitted. Here's another photograph showing the fitting of the landing gear to the fuselage. There's quite a bit going on in this picture. If you could ignore the ugly guy that's in it, you can see that the wings, yeah, the legs have not been shaped yet. There's still the rough cut gear legs, but all of the brackets are in place. I've got my spreader bars temporarily put in place, and I believe I'm trying to fit the ash block back into place. I've got a couple of the cross support cables in place, just verifying the angles on the wing strut attach fittings for the cables, and then the angles that the little tabs that the cables attach to down at the ash blocks. Those metal tabs, verifying the angles on those with using the cables. What else? That's pretty much about it, I guess. So brackets are in place, cables are going in just to check bend angles, and spreader bars, and again just an overall general fitting of all the many pieces, parts that make up the landing gear, and getting ready to move on to actually shaping the legs.